All right. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Plan Amendments and Restatements. My name is Jeannie Sutton. I'm a Managing Director with Strategic Retirement Partners. We appreciate you joining us for this next event of our 2025 Plan Sponsor Fiduciary Training and Education Series. Just a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. All lines are muted, but we do welcome your questions. If you have one, please use your phone to scan the QR code. You'll find one at the bottom of each slide and a big QR code in the beginning of the presentation. That's going to take you to an online form where you may submit a question. We will be monitoring those throughout the session. This session is being recorded, and we'll share the recording with all who registered for the webinar later this week. Attendees can also earn 1 hour of SHRM and PSCA CE credit, which we will include when we share the recording. I am very excited to introduce today's speaker, Ms. Bonnie Trickle, someone many of you should know by now. Bonnie is the founder and chief solutions officer of Endeavor Retirement, a consulting firm dedicated to solving the problems for plan sponsors, advisors, and service providers. She is a big friend of us at SRP, and if you've joined any of these before, you probably recognize her. So very honored to share the stage with Ms. Bonnie Trickle.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very excited to be here, and again, honored to be able to present with Jeannie and the team from SRP today. So we have a very exciting topic as well, as we are going to cover plan amendments and restatements, which I know many of you are probably very, very excited about. I see Jeannie's face and excitement. So yeah, we've got a lot to cover today, and I'm excited. I'll give a little bit of the kind of like, here's the technical, and I'm excited because I know Jeannie has so much experience working with plan sponsors, just like many of you on the line. And so she'll be able to provide a lot of that real practical experience that you're looking for in dealing with your retirement plans. And it's actually quite timely that we're having this conversation, because we're really thinking about a couple of different things coming together. Maybe all at once is a good thing and maybe a bad thing, depending on how you think about it. So we've got all of those Secure 2.0 provisions that are all going to come together in our next restatement cycle, because for the most part, for many of you who have 401k plans, those amendments are going to be due by the end of 2026. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. And then we also have to think about what's going to be called our next restatement cycle. And so depending on where you are in your journey of working with retirement plans, this might be old hat for you. You might have done this many times in the past, or for some of you, this might be your first restatement cycle that you'll be probably in the process of starting here very shortly. So in general, we're going to talk in terms of ERISA covered plans. I'll probably mostly refer to kind of our 401k restatement cycle, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't apply on the 403b side as well. So again, really, really excited to be here. Excited also that you do have access to that QR code, like you'll see in that bottom of your screen, like the one. So hopefully we'll just kind of tackle your questions as they come up. But as mentioned, this is the 6th webinar that we have in our plan sponsor series. And today we're going to cover a couple of different things. We are going to go over, I've been throwing out terms like restatement cycle. We're going to cover some basics, like what is your fiduciary duty as it relates to plan amendments and restatements, and what is that? What does that mean? We'll talk a little bit about just kind of the overview of just your plan document in general, kind of the anatomy of those plan documents, amendments, how that's different from your SPV. And then we will get into some of those more practical things. So how does the impact of legislative changes or regulatory updates from things like CARES, if we can remember back to CARES and Secure 1.0 and then Secure 2.0, how does that impact your plan document? And then how can you just really implement some more, I'm going to say like practical and tactical things for plan compliance going forward. And I think, again, we'll talk about some of the like, why does this even matter? Like, why do you care? What's the big, like, important piece of this? And maybe I'll start there just really briefly with the the big reason to pay attention to this and to work with partners like, Jeannie and team at SRP on things related to your plan document is a lot of times on these webinars, we focus on the ERISA side. So we know we've got our ERISA compliance, and then we've got our tax code compliance or internal revenue code. So today we're actually not going to focus as much on the ERISA side, other than to take note of the fact that ERISA does require we have a plan document. But instead, we're going to focus more on our other side of compliance, which is on the tax code. And that's really this whole issue of we're required, in order for the plan to stay as a qualified plan, which that's what people enjoy about it, right? Is the tax qualified status of our plans and getting those tax benefits. But in order to keep that, you really have to ensure that the plan operates in line with the plan document. And so that's really what this is all about, is how do we make sure we actually have a plan document that is in line with the tax code regulation and framework? How do we keep that document up to date regardless of what format we have? And then really think about what that impact is if we don't, which is the potential to lose our tax qualified status. So that's like the 50,000 foot, why should you stay with us to the end, except for to just, get some maybe CE out of it. It's also really just that tax qualified status piece. So with that, we're going to go ahead and just jump into the content itself. And I'm going to just let Jeannie keep me on track with anything that I forget along the way. She's going to chime in at any point here. So starting with types of plan documents. So when we think about plan documents, we want to think about that there are a couple of different, I'm going to call formats or forms to the type of plan document that you might have. Now, I'll get into this a little bit more in the next couple of slides, but there's two main types of plan documents that are out there. And again, all plans are required to have a written form of a plan document, and you could have one of two formats. You could either have what I'm going to call this pre-approved plan document, or you could have a custom plan document. We'll talk about the pre-approved a little bit more here on the next slide, but when we think about the custom plan document, I'll maybe start with the second one on the screen here, which is typically going to be drafted by a law firm. At least in my experience, that's what I've always seen, is it's a custom, drafted just for you document, and it's usually going to be legal counsel who's drafting that. The real benefit is that you get real maximum flexibility for exactly what your plan needs. You're not trying to fit it into something else, but if you've got some or a variety of things maybe that your plan really needs, you're going to get that maximum flexibility. And that's really why you'd want a custom document. From my perspective, is you've got a lot of different things that require maximum flexibility, and you get that from a law firm. In that case, if you're going down the custom path, that's going to require you to get a determination letter from the IRS just to confirm that that document meets all the qualification requirements. Now, one of the things I'd say is when I started practicing law, I think a lot of attorneys actually spent a lot of their time drafting documents. I would say in the last 10 years or so, I think a lot of people have moved away from having a custom document. And this might sound like I'm really bad at business development, but most of the clients that I've worked with, I've actually really told them, you've got to move away from having a custom document. I don't know, Jeannie, what have you seen in your experience with clients of having custom versus a pre-approved document?
It's the exact same. I think at the current point, we only have one client still on a custom document. Not only are we moving to it just for economies of scale, right? It's a little bit lower cost to move to a pre-approved document. The same goes for the cost when it comes to an amendment or making a change, right? The legal bills can start to add up. But also, for the record, a lot of record keepers out there, like Fidelity would be a good example. They don't generally even allow you to be on a custom document. So it's just been kind of the tide of the industry.
That's such a good, it's not just the cost, it is the making sure that then you've got a provider who can actually administer to the document that you've created. Because if someone can't administer to it, what's the point of having it?
Yeah.
Yeah, really good point. So then maybe what we'll do is talk a little bit more about the pre-approved document, which is, I would say, again, probably what most of you are going to have is what I'm going to refer to as a pre-approved document. And we'll get into a little bit more of like how the pre-approved document works. But first, before we go there, some of you might say, hey, lady, this is just so basic. But let's talk a little bit more about the anatomy of your documents that are probably going to be your pre-approved documents. I will say that sometimes I will request from a new client or, I'll be working with someone and I'll say, hey, can you send me the plan document? And what I typically get is a variety of different responses. And I'm going to say they're not always what I would deem as the correct response. Here's what I mean by that. Sometimes I will get something called a summary plan description instead of a plan document. Now, the summary plan description is maybe a good place for us to start, which is what it's supposed to be is the plain English summary for your employees to understand what's in the plan. Now, arguably, I don't think any of these are actually plain English, but that's maybe a different issue. It's supposed to be the shorter form in plain English summary of what's actually in the plan document. And the summary plan description is something that all plans are required to have. And we'll talk about SMMs a little bit later probably, but that summary plan description is something that participants are supposed to get, I believe, 90 days before becoming covered by the plan or when they're starting with the plan. And then you've got to have that SPD. You've got to make sure you're updating that over time. So a lot of people include that with like their new employee packet for eligibility into the plan. They'll maybe post it on some sort of intranet site I see a lot. And so you've got to make sure you're updating that over time. And then you do have a requirement that anytime you're updating your plan, you are sending out that updated summary plan description within 210 days following and the year following the year in which you made that update, if that's not confusing at all, but it's 210 days into that next year after you've made your update. So that's your SPD. But your SPD is not your plan document. So your plan document, if you have a pre-approved plan doc, is probably two components. You probably have what I'm going to call a base plan document, or someone might refer to that as a BPD because we like acronyms. But your base plan document is probably going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 40 to 100 pages of paragraphs. And it actually is where I'm going to say the good stuff is. It's where all of that good information is that tells you a lot of times, like maybe it's something about how to administer benefits if a minor becomes the beneficiary. It might tell you, I mean, lots of just detailed stuff is in that base plan document. You'll just find a variety of things that you didn't even think were there because you probably didn't read it because most people don't. But then you also have this other thing that goes with it, and it's called an adoption agreement. The adoption agreement is how you actually know what your plan has elected based on that base plan document. So they go together. They're like, what would you call it? Like peanut butter and jelly. They have to go together. And you're electing, hey, I want to apply these things from the base plan document by checking these different boxes in the adoption agreement. Now, there's a couple of different ways you might see that depending on if you're with, call it Fidelity versus Principal versus whomever. And Jeannie's probably got some good examples based on what she's seen. But what we want to keep in mind is that those documents together are what form your plan document. You need them both if someone says, hey, I need a plan document. Because one thing to keep in mind is that you are not required to proactively distribute your plan document to participants. But if somebody requests your plan document, then you would provide that plan document, both components of it, upon a reasonable request. So that's kind of your 50,000 foot view on your plan document. What are those components of it, and when do you provide it? Jeannie, what did I miss there in terms of just kind of the basics of the plan document?
I think it's funny that you were like, this is probably too basic. And I've been in the industry for 20 years and like, I still struggle with this. So I think from a practical perspective, let's say you're wanting to look up a question like, what is our definition of compensation? Or does our plan allow for loans? Do I need to be going to what we adopted, the adoption agreement, or do I need to be going to the basic plan document?
Such a good question. I always say you really should look at both, right? So you probably, let's say you're using the W-2 definition of compensation for your compensation question. You know, for the most part, you're probably going to get most of what you need from the adoption agreement. You're going to go to your adoption agreement. You're going to see we checked, the W-2 definition. And then you're going to go look further down in that adoption agreement and see, well, do we have any other like exclusions from that definition? And there's, probably like 2 to 4 sections related to compensation that you're going to look. But here's where that can get messy is there might be some, I'm going to call it defined term that you need to look up. Well, what does that actually mean? Maybe it's related to post severance compensation, for example. And we won't go too far down this path today, but you might need to look up, well, what does post severance compensation actually mean? How does that actually work? Then that's when we go over to our base plan document to see, oh, in this document, that's how that's defined based on what box I've checked, for example. Or maybe it's related to, something, bonuses is pretty straightforward. So I was trying to think of a different one, but, some of those exclusions, you might actually want to look up the actual definition of how does it apply. And the base plan document might tell us exactly how that applies.
And when in doubt, ask the record keeper and administrator to confirm.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good, and you might find that they say, well, we can't give you legal advice, but what they can do is point you to, well, just can you show me which sections this applies, both in my adoption agreement and my base plan document? They can show you where that is. And so I think that's a really good tip is like you don't always have to have both, but for the most part, there's many of these examples where there's going to be a definition and it's going to help you understand how that definition applies. I find like elapsed time, for example, is one where it's like, how is elapsed time defined? And then you need to go to the other one. And that might actually be a really good segue to just kind of another concept along the lines of this pre-approved plan documents versus what we were just talking about here a moment ago when we talked about, okay, well, what's the difference if I'm getting this as a custom document versus I'm getting it from, my record keeper as a pre-approved plan document. And the rules have changed here a little bit, but one of the things I said earlier is, hey, why does all this matter? Like, why do I even care? Well, again, we care because of that tax qualified status. So one thing we want to keep in mind is that the IRS is, and again, this is going to get into this whole like restatement cycle concept we'll talk about here in a moment, but the IRS issues these things called both opinion letters and they issue things called determination letters. So for opinion letters, those are going to be issued for these pre-approved plan documents that are going out to your like record keeper or TPA. I do think there are some law firms that operate on a pre-approved plan as well that they're actually doing just like a record keeper, but I think that's rare. So I think it's generally going to be like your record keeper, someone that during what we're going to call this restatement cycle that happens on a set interval. So, for example, right now, it's once every 6 years that 401k plans start this restatement cycle. And we are now starting the next round of restatements. In fact, the record keepers or third party administrators, they're already doing it. It just hasn't made its way to plan sponsors listening yet. But they've already done this process where they've went to the IRS and said, here's our document, here's what we propose. And then the IRS says, great, we're going to issue an opinion letter. And that opinion letter is tied to that document that is approved as a pre-approved plan document. So Fidelity has one, Principal has one, TIA has one, all of these providers have one if you're on their document. One thing you want to keep in mind here is that if you are operating on one of those providers' documents, you want to always keep that IRS opinion letter in your files that is given to you with your document. So when you go through the restatement cycle, you're going to get your new document. It's going to come with an IRS opinion letter. You're probably like, what is this thing? Why do I need it? You want to keep that along with your document because that shows that you have an IRS opinion letter and that your document's approved. So that's something that you should keep in your kind of fiduciary file as a plan sponsor. Another thing that you want to keep in mind is, have you ever seen on your adoption agreements, if you've gone through this process before, where there's sometimes like you can choose A, B, or C, and then you could maybe fill in the blank for how you want to do some of these provisions. One thing to be cautious of when you get into the fill in the blanks for these various provisions is that if you go too far outside of the provision as stated in that pre-approved plan document, you will start to run afoul of potentially that pre-approved IRS opinion letter. In other words, you don't want to jeopardize your pre-approved status by creating your own provisions in that plan document. So again, just be cautious that you stay within your pre-approved plan doc and don't color too far outside of the lines when you are doing something in that plan document on a pre-approved plan document. I would distinguish that too from a determination letter. You might hear that thrown around a little bit as well. Determination letters are just for individually designed plans. The opinion letter that you want, that's going to come with your set of documents that you get in this restatement cycle. Anything, Jeannie, you want to add there, or any questions you typically get?
Yeah, so a question we ran into, and I think it was on an opinion letter, not a determination letter, was it kind of caught the client off guard because it doesn't specifically name their company or them as a plan sponsor. It actually names like the owner of the pre-approved document. So your opinion letter won't say your name, right?
Yeah, good call.
Okay.
So like that opinion letter is going to go to whoever has requested it from the IRS, and then you are using that provider's document. That's a really great point.
And the name is not always like obvious, like Fidelity or Principal. Like it's like, an EIN and a name maybe of a subsidiary that you're not familiar with. So it looks weird.
Yes, that could be the case too, because it could be whatever third party maybe they're using for document services. And so some of the record keepers are using a third party for document services, and it might not be their name. So that's another good point as well. Yeah. Any other kind of practical tips that you see from that perspective? I think one of the things that folks do get confused on is it used to be that individual employers or plan sponsors would go and get their own determination letter. I saw that a lot several years ago. I think there could be something to do with the lack of staffing at the IRS, but the IRS, I don't know that. That is not a fact. Do not say you learned that on this webinar. But I think it was around 5 or 6 years ago that they actually changed those rules, and no longer, it's only in very limited circumstances do you get a determination letter. So it can be when starting a plan, when terminating a plan, and then I believe in some very limited M&A situations that you can get a determination letter. But otherwise, individual plan sponsors do not go and get their own determination letter, because I think there were many, many more determination letters that were being sought several years ago. But that's one less thing for plan sponsors to have to do. I think with that, we'll move on to something that also I think can cause some confusion, which is just the difference between amendments versus restatements. So I've kind of been dancing around this a little bit, but I think we're all very, very familiar with this concept of a plan restatement. So this idea that, hey, we've taken a look at our plan document and we've decided that we want to add a provision around hardships, or we've decided that we want to change our definition of compensation, those types of things that, you're going to make that change, you're going to update your plan as of 1/1, and then on a go forward basis, so long as you don't have any issues with benefits, rates, and features, you're going to make this change going forward, and away you go. Those are what we would refer to as an amendment. It's a specific one-time change going forward. And in those cases, you follow a process where you are likely working in conjunction with, someone like Jeannie and your team. You are maybe consulting legal counsel. You're going to probably, depending on if it was a settler decision or not, you're going to have the proper decision maker documented in your meeting minutes, and then you'd be working to notify your plan document provider, and they're going to respond with probably some sort of, it's going to be a couple pages that's going to attach to your plan document. So you're not getting a full document again, but it's going to be a couple of pages that attach on the end. The downside of that is going to be that sometimes you might have many, many amendments over the course of, this 6-year window, and you might end up with many restatements that you need to keep track, or pardon me, many amendments that you need to keep track of. So you can end up with quite the stack there. Each time you do an amendment, you can, and it's, again, Jeannie's going to be able to weigh in on this better than me, but you can get either probably an SMM or summary of material modifications, or in some cases you might be able, which is my preference, to get a full summary plan description, because you do have that duty, as we talked about, to notify folks that, hey, we updated our plan. And so then you've got to send that out either as your full SPD or your SMM. Now, I say I don't like SMMs for the same reason I don't like amendments, because they start to stack up over time, and then it's hard for people to know, hey, wait, I thought I looked at my adoption agreement, like this lady told me. I looked at my base plan document, and I thought I knew what my definition of comp was. But then I had to go look at 5 different amendments, and I found on the 5th amendment that actually our definition of compensation changed. And now I actually didn't get it right when I told someone what it was. So that's the type of reason that I don't like SMMs. I prefer it in an updated SPD. But legally, either one is perfectly appropriate as long as you have one of them.
Yeah, it's harder to keep up with plan amendments than you think. Even when we're consistently working with a plan, a lot of ours have gone through several, changes in just the past year. In SRP CRM, we are creating these milestones for these plan amendments so that it is easier to go back and just track and remember what all has been done on the plan, just like we're keeping the amendments saved in the archive. It's also helpful, right, at the end of the year when the auditor says, did you have any plan amendments last year? Like, it's easy to go and pull, but they do stack up, and actually it becomes even more noticeable when you have turnover in your HR or your benefits department, because you might remember, oh, I better go check. I know we changed something, but somebody new isn't. So it's nice to have kind of the cheat sheet milestones that we track. It's also nice to have them in the archive, but personally, I'm excited for a full restatement. I'm excited for clean plan documents on all of our clients.
Absolutely. And that's a good way to distinguish. So we've talked about these amendments or these little one-offs. Then I think we got a question about, getting a new or an updated opinion letter.
Mhm.
And maybe that's a good segue into, so once we have this restatement cycle, so again, what is a restatement cycle? This is going to happen once every 6 years. So some of you might be doing this for the first time. It is a set cycle that is set by the IRS. Technically, I guess it doesn't have to be every 6 years, but it's every 6 years. And so it's always on this rolling basis. If you had a 403B plan, for example, that's on a different staggered cycle. So 401ks are different than 403Bs, for example. So the 401k cycle, to the question about new opinion letters or updated opinion letters, what happens is, think of all of the changes that have happened in the law in the last 5 years. So it's always on this like rolling basis that the IRS is keeping a list, and they say, hey, the plan document, I'm going to call it template, so to speak, that you have to have, because I kind of think of it that way, right? It's like the template that in our fidelity example that they're going to use. Here's all the things that they have to update from legislative and regulatory changes in their quote template. And then they're going to submit that to the IRS. The IRS is going to then, at that time, that's when there's this updated opinion letter that would be issued. And it's only during this once every, rolling basis 5 or 6 years that template gets updated, new opinion letter comes out, and then that cycle rolls out to plan sponsors. So I'm guessing for many of you, this is the times that you're probably starting to hear from your service providers to say, hey, we're lining up our queue, so to speak, for next year, and you will go through your restatement cycle or process during XYZ time because it's got to be finished here in this next year, basically. And Jeannie, I don't know what you're seeing practically of how some of these service providers are starting to reach out.
No, I haven't seen anybody yet. I've
Yet.
seen them
Okay.
say they expect it to be. I think late 2026 going to be it will be a bottleneck, honestly.
Yeah.
But I mean, wouldn't they, if you go through a full document restatement, aren't they also going to provide you an updated opinion letter?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the only time that you're getting that is once you do. So you're going to get your packet next year. So maybe let's just talk about briefly. This might again seem elementary, but the nuts and bolts of what this typically looks like, because I think this is where I foresee the biggest plan compliance errors coming up. For most of you listening, I don't think you're ever going to get sued. I think where you're going to have a problem most likely, and you're not going to notice it for 2, 3 years down the line, is from restatement processes. Because what typically happens, in my experience with many providers, is they're going to have a process where they take your current adoption agreement and they are going to, I'm going to say, translate that onto their new adoption agreement template. So they're going to reach out to you and say, hey, good news, ABC, plan sponsor, we have your new document. You have a couple weeks. Take a look at it. Let us know if you have any changes. Otherwise, please sign it and return it. And in that packet that they're going to give you a couple of different things. One is going to be their new opinion letter. So you should save that for your file. One is going to be that base plan document. Depending on how they have their trust services set up, they might have some sort of trust document in there. They're going to have the adoption agreement and that base plan document. You're going to really want to take a look at your current adoption agreement compared to their proposed new adoption agreement. And that check the box translation from old adoption agreement to new adoption agreement is really where I think it's critical to take and just think about a couple of things, and we have a slide on this a little bit later, but it really is thinking through, does my document do and say what we're actually doing? And does it
Mhm.
match what my old document said? Because that checking of the wrong box, one of the things we talk about is there is no such thing as just oh, it was a Scrivener's error. We checked the wrong box, but we really meant for it to say something else. And I don't know, Jeannie, if you've seen some kind of plan compliance errors come up during this process.
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing you can compare it to is if any of you have gone through a record keeper change that necessitated a plan document change, and you have, this 2-hour plan document side by side call. Everybody pays a lot of attention to it when they're changing record keepers or administrators. I'm worried, like Bonnie's saying, this is going to kind of fly under everybody's radar and they're just going to say, okay, looks good, when really you do need to carve out some time to sit down and line by line it.
Yeah, it's and I think it can last sometimes a little bit longer too, because like you said, you have this 2-hour session, but then you've got to send people back, like, because it's
Yeah,
not just the one HR person, it's someone from HR, someone from payroll, someone from
payroll.
finance. That payroll piece is critical. So I think that's where I would just emphasize making sure you have the right people to be a part of this process and really understand those different components. So, why is it even bigger of an issue this time around? Well, from my perspective, it's because this is all coming in conjunction with Secure 2.0 amendments. So, it's not just like, hey, we've got this restatements, cycle coming up, which has like a few minor changes from the last few years. But if you think of the compound nature of Secure 1, CARES, Secure 2, we've just had a lot of change and it's all coming together in what we're going to see coming up. So, one thing to keep in mind is that there is a general amendment deadline for your 401k plans of December 31st, 2026. Now, again, you can always potentially see changes to that, and there will be some things that may not make it into base plan documents, given that a lot of these base plan documents have already been what I'm going to call they're already approved. And so some things like the Roth catch up provisions. We just got final regs literally just like, a month ago. So some of those things are not going to make it in, but you do still have to have your final amendments done by the end of 2026. So again, look closely. The big headline news is don't get in the weeds on that today necessarily, but really just be looking for how your document provider is handling these things, and keep in mind that we are looking at more complexity because of the integration of Secure 2.0 this restatement cycle. So you've kind of got both of those things coming together. One of the things that I think we wanted to just do briefly is a quick reminder on how some of those Secure 2.0 provisions are integrated into both amendments and restatements, even if they don't all fit into this restatement cycle. So keeping in mind, and again, this is like a stretch back to the end of 2022, but when we looked at Secure 2.0, and there were almost 100 different provisions. Keep in mind that some of those provisions were required provisions, or what I'd call mandatory provisions, meaning you had to do them. So they have to go into your plan document. While others of those provisions were optional provisions. Really good ideas if you were trying to accomplish certain things, maybe student loan matching, emergency withdrawals, employer Roth contributions, but maybe it's something where you said, hey, that's not a good fit for our people, or maybe that was something that you said, we might consider that in the future, but doesn't really make sense for us right now. And so for those optional provisions, those are things that you don't have to meet that December 31st, 2026 deadline for 401k plans because it's optional. You could make a change and add that like you could any amendment anytime in the future, totally up to you. Contrast that though with these mandatory provisions where you are absolutely required to have those changes made by the end of 2026. Here's where it might get a little bit more complex. And again, I think this is where this is a real exercise in project management and communication. And people like, working with Jeannie and the SRP team and your providers is going to be critically important, because one of the things that I noticed is on some of these provisions, there were different providers who did different, I'm going to call it methods for opt-in versus opt-out. And so I think, again, it made good sense the way many providers did it because they had to create maximum efficiency. But that's one thing to keep in mind is you may be tracking some things that you're like, hey, I thought that was optional, but maybe it was a notice from the provider that said, we're adding this to your plan unless you tell us otherwise. And it was really an optional provision, but for some reason or another, they went with we're going to opt you into it unless you opt out of it. And so, and I don't know, Jeannie, if you have any kind of thoughts on what you saw there, but I think that's part of what makes this a little bit more complicated is there's the rules, and then there's what did your specific provider do with XYZ provision?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what they did. So if your plan was bundled, you got this form that said, unless we hear from you, this is happening. Now, I will say industry wide, a lot of those just kind of like default settings were pretty similar. None of them were any of the obscure optional ideas.
Yeah.
It was the things that like for example, the force out up to 7,000, like widely accepted. We all want to move to that. So from provider to provider, the automatic defaults were pretty consistent, pretty explainable, but you still need to know what they were. The optional provisions, if you had a TPA, they were often sending something like a Secure 2.0 checklist, and they would walk you through everything and let you choose. And that I actually preferred that practice a little bit better because it brought on more conversation. Um, so the defaults, you need to be aware of what just happened to your plan if you don't know. As far as the optional provisions, what we keep having to remind people is these may have been legislated as an option, right? Like they may have said, matching, 401k matching based on a student loan payment is an option. That does not mean the industry was ready to implement. And it certainly varies across providers. We spent in our region with our clients some of the more obscure things not quite ready, like employer match Roth, student loan matching, really cool ideas, things we're excited about, just not quite ready to implement. We set those aside. We did spend quite a bit of time locally talking about the new hardship provisions, and really kind of decide, breaking down those, understanding what the client related to or liked, and then more importantly, adding the layer of their provider and what their provider could accommodate, because not every provider could accommodate all of the new hardship provisions. So Secure 2.0 is like eating an elephant. You just kind of got to take it one bite at a time. I would start by focusing on what's mandatory. Then I would look at what you might have been defaulted into, and then you can start looking at some of the optional provisions.
I love that analogy to eating the elephant one bite at a time because, I think, and like when you look at the couple of the ones that we highlighted on this page, right? These were some of the ones that I think were the biggest deal for folks, over this kind of last year. When you think about the ones here, super catch up, for example, that is that age 60 to 63. That was just optional. So that's one. Section 109, that's that additional catch up for age 60 to 63. That was an optional one. Contrast that with the last one on this page, which to me is what's causing folks the most heartburn. And I actually gave a presentation to a group of TPAs on that one last week. And I mean, it was just so, you have really technical professionals that it's really a struggle right now. And again, that Roth catch-up contribution, it's so funny because there's so many components of this. Like we say, it's if someone made, 145,000 and or more in that prior year FICA wages, then they're going to have to make that catch-up contribution as Roth. But at the same time, it's like, well, that's not even exactly true because that 145 is an index number. So again, put a big star by that because we don't know what that number actually is yet.
That employer. It's at
Yes.
that employer.
Yeah, and it's at that employer. And then, there's all kinds of different provisions for how or ways you can, if you're going to make corrections on it, then there's this whole deemed method thing. So again, we could do a whole nother session just on the Roth catch-up contributions, but the big takeaway there is that is not optional. And that is something that will have to be documented because again, and we don't have to go totally down this path, but to use the corrective methods that were in the final regulations that came out about a month ago, there are certain things that will have to be in your plan doc. I anticipate some of those things will be kind of that interplay between the base plan doc and your adoption agreement. Some of those things I anticipate are going to be in the base plan document. And so there's some things there where that section 603, be on the lookout for that. But for now, make sure you're talking to your payroll provider and your record keeper because they're probably running around quickly to figure out how that's all going to play out. These other ones, we can take any questions if people have them. And I apologize. One of the questions was the 145 is an index number. I should have clarified. That means it's indexed to inflation. So just like contribution amounts go up every year, that 145, it's going to go up. The 145, and keep in mind, you're now tracking different, I don't know what you call these people. I've heard lots of different acronyms for them. You now essentially have a different group of highly compensated individuals in effect. So whatever your favorite acronym is for your new group of highly paid folks, the 145 was when we were supposed to start that provision back 1/1 of 24. And so this will be something that when limits come out every year, you're going to see the limits on that as well, the associated increase for that as well. Jeannie, anything I missed there?
Well, like you said, we could do a whole session on Roth catch-up mandate. But if hopefully you're not looking at this and thinking this is all new, but let's pretend you're just hearing about this all for the first time. focus on the Roth catch-up contributions, and then I would say long-term part-time employees is probably the second one you want to be aware of. It's a mandate, but a lot of our clients are choosing not to even play that game and just change the provisions of their document so they are not having to meet that particular requirement. I would say those two are like kind of like your time sensitive, you need to figure it out. Would you agree, Bonnie?
Spot on. I think those are the two, like I would be focused on if you have not focused or made a plan for long-term part-time, you're slightly behind. You might not have a problem, but just making sure you figured that out. Same with Roth catch-up. And I think the other kind of pieces to round out this, and we'll have a quick action item slide on this, but make sure you're just thinking about you understand how your provider implemented for all of these things. Like, do you know where that checklist is, so to speak, if you're working with a TPA or a record keeper? Do you know when you started, effectively implementing on some of these optional ones? If you did, what was the date you started to implement that? And if you moved service providers in the last year and your checklist is somewhere else, did that translate to whatever new service provider you're working with?
And I think that's really important. One thing we've ran into as a consultant is clients are asking about these. They want to adopt some of the optional provisions. We talk about it, we discuss it in committee, and we vote to do it, right? Well, that's our operational starting point. If someone, wants to take advantage of one of these new options, they technically can. We get pushback from the third party administrators and record keepers saying, well, it doesn't have to be in the document until the end of next year. It truly is why you need an SRP consultant there to help you fill that bridge, meet, operational, right? Operationally implement them and track them until it is fully like cemented in the document. But these, could have been implemented beforehand.
Yeah, and I think that really does highlight the value of working with a consultant. Um, so kind of wrapping this up, what are those actual steps? And this could be when you're doing an amendment or specific to Secure 2.0 provisions. But I do think it's helpful to have some sort of quick, checklist or action item set so that you've got all those steps down. And again, if you're working with a consultant, you've already got this process in place. One that I will highlight that I see folks sometimes have missteps on is who's actually making those decisions. And I know we are starting to get short on time, but one thing to just keep in mind is that many things related to the plan actually, in fact, are what I'm going to call business decisions or made by the settler, the business person, not actually something that that fiduciary committee is deciding. But that doesn't mean that the fiduciary committee shouldn't have, I'm going to call it some report back to the committee to say, hey, the business decided that we actually want to add the student loan provision, or the business decided we don't want to do that. But then, the people who are actually going to carry that provision out is your fiduciary committee, and they can report that in the minutes, document it, and carry that out. But it really is just making sure you understand. I'm going to call that two-hat principle, because fiduciaries carry a different level of liability that under ERISA, which is that higher set of liability than a business person who is really only answering to the business and not required to do what's in participants' best interest. I think we've covered most of the other things in kind of this set of action steps, but anything else, G, that we want to cover from what are the proper steps all the way from we decide to make an amendment to don't forget to send out your SPD or SMM?
I guess I would ask you, the SPD, I think, is like a stressful like moment for all of my clients. And I found myself in the end being like, just send one every year, right? And because technically
Yeah.
it's 5 years, right? If you don't make a change.
Yep,
Is it
that's right.
overkill just to throw it in with all of the other notices at the end of the year?
No, actually, that's a really great practice. And probably, I'm guessing most of your clients, they're already sending out some packet or multiple packets with a summary annual report, depending on when that 5500 got filed. They may have a safe harbor
Safe
notice. Like,
harbor notice, QDIA, summary annual, like what might as well throw in the SPD, right?
Yep, you can do a quick little cover note that says you've got all these things included. Let us know if you have questions, and you put them all together. And I think if you have some sort of SOP or kind of standard procedure on that, it just creates this ongoing, you've met that requirement and you've never got an issue. And I think that instead of trying to track the 5 years or, hey, well, we made a change. So I don't do math well. So 210 days into the following year in which we made this up, like it just gets messy.
It gets messy. Well, and then, some of the record keepers and providers send automatic alerts every time there's an update. So like, let's say, for example, you're a company that's often acquiring others or adding participating employers. You're going to get an alert every time you add a participating employer that the SPD has been updated and needs to be distributed. That will start to really weigh on you. So, I always tell clients, have a new hire packet for notices, have an end of year packet for notices. You're never going to get in trouble for sending too many, right? And that should catch any requirements if you just kind of follow that cadence.
Yep, I think that's spot on. Having those really quick packets or kind of procedures, and that goes along to actually one thing that I'll kind of mention as we start to end is, when you think about being able to correct for having errors for non-compliance, you want to be able to lean into EPCRs. And I'm actually going to maybe switch a few slides forward, and we'll end on kind of this case study of like, why do you do this? We talked about the reason to do this is for maintaining your tax qualified status. Well, when you don't keep up with your plan restatement cycles or you don't keep up with proper plan amendments, one of the things that can result is that you would want to call upon EPCRs, or rather the IRS's program for correcting your plan. But I think some folks forget that one of the basic requirements, because this is a little bit like fuzzy in some ways, is that to rely on EPCRs, particularly if you're ever going to self-correct, you have to be able to show you have policies and procedures. Now, a lot of people will say, well, what are policies and procedures for my retirement plan? And really just having things, Jeannie, like what you described, they don't have to be like a giant procedure manual. They can be things like, hey, we have steps that say we're going to send out the SPD. We have steps that show how we're going to actually do our restatements. That is a procedure. Again, it's not super clear exactly what you might have, but you have to show that you've essentially tried to comply through having procedures. If you don't have that, you can't rely on EPCRs for self-correction, and you need to be able to show in a VCP process the same, that you actually do have procedures in place. And so I think that's a really good reminder that exactly what Jeannie pointed out, just having even bullet points in the file for someone is a great set of procedures to have.
And we did get a question about notices. And, can it be done electronically or physically mailed? General rule of thumb, if you have a work email, these can be sent electronically, which is why it's kind of easier just to send more than less. If you don't have a verified work email terminated participant, then you would need to mail those. And I mean, there's probably some variance in the type of notice and how it's sent, but that's the general rule of thumb.
Yeah, and I think, again, that's something just checking in to make sure. There's different rules for IRS required notice and DOL required notice, but in general, if people have access to a computer at work, then you're going to be okay. So I would try to do as many of those things electronically as possible, so long as the rules permit. I know we've skipped a couple of slides, and I want to make sure that we save time for any remaining questions, as well as any closing remarks. Jeannie, is there anything that we didn't hit on today that you want to make sure that we cover before the end of today's session?
I mean, no, not necessarily. We had some conversation before when we were preparing. It really is a catch-22 because as a consultant worried about turnover in your HR department, I kind of want you guys to keep a cheat sheet, right, of the important questions that you have. And, Bonnie's perspective is absolutely right. You don't want to create any shorthand notes. You always want to go back to the document. So I would just say I empathize with the fact that us non-legal people have to go to a 100-page, not one, but two documents to get answers to our questions. So, I would also focus on we're storing the documents, we're saving them in your archive, we're notating all of these things, but don't overlook turnover in your company, the transition of knowledge, right? Where things are saved, who to call. Don't miss all of that in this and making sure you're documenting it. You have a way internally to track this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point because we did talk about it. I was like, don't have those short form notes because they'll always get out of track with the document. But I recognize that there does have to be a better training mechanism than saying, and it comes up even when I'm dealing with like consultants too, because they want to be able to help and do the same thing. So I recognize there has to be a better method than just saying, oh, don't have any of those short form things. No, people don't need that. Yeah, people do need and want that. So just make sure that they stay in line with the document. I think that's a really great point. Um, well, with that, I know, we've got a couple of just action items, and I think we've shared some action items all along the way today. One maybe key action item would be if you didn't take anything else away from today, it really would be going and locating your base plan document, your adoption agreement, any amendments you have, making sure all those, for the most part, this has largely been mitigated because of the electronic signatures that a lot of providers use. But I even still just got a call yesterday, for example, on an issue where unsigned document. They can't find a signed copy. So making sure that those documents, they do have a signature on them. They're dated with a signature. And so that you really know where that complete executed document and all amendments are. And I think just that's a really great start as you start thinking about heading into that next restatement cycle. And then again, those other kind of secure 2.0 provisions we talked about, making sure you're going to be ready for how that integrates into your document. With that, I'll probably, Jeannie, turn it over to you for any other final action items or questions that we have before we wrap up today.
I'm not seeing any more questions, so I would just say thank you all for joining us. This concludes this quarter's session. We certainly appreciate you being here. A recording will be sent out later on this week once we get it through compliance approval along with CE information. I think Bonnie just had the CE information on the screen. I think so. Was it the last slide? Yeah, there's the information. So thank you guys for joining us. If you had any questions, reach out to your managing director in your area for SRP. They will certainly be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.